All right. Hello, friends. We're about to start the broadcast tonight. I want to start by welcoming you all to the show, to the broadcast. We have a really good show lined up for you today. If you follow Stand to Reason, you'll know that we spend a lot of time trying to help you teach your kids to think biblically and think critically about the world. And we understand that the motivation of some parents, I feel it, is to kind of isolate, to ignore some of the false ideas that are out there, ideas that we're not really certain about. That idea may be right-hearted, but it's wrong-headed. Rather than isolating our kids, our young people, we have a different approach at Stand to Reason. What we want to do is inoculate students from false ideas so that they're able to defend against those ideas. And contemporary critical theory, I think, is one of those false ideas. In fact, I think it's become a dominant ideology that's undergirding a lot of what's going on in the current culture. Contemporary critical theory functions a lot like a worldview. And what I mean by that is it influences what we believe and as a result of that, how we behave. Okay. And so unfortunately, many people, especially young people, are being taken in to are taken captive, to coin a phrase from Paul, by this dangerous philosophy. And that's why I'm really excited to have this interview with my guest. To help us think through this issue, we have brought in someone, and I don't think there's a better person to bring in. We're bringing in Neil Shenvy. This guy is in the thick of it when it comes to this issue. If you don't believe me, well, you just need to hop onto Twitter and just see the kind of abuse that this man is taking. So Neil, welcome to the show here.
Thank you, Tim.
And so what is, by the way, your Twitter handle? What is that?
Well, just Neil Shenvy.
Okay.
Neilshenvi.
And you're pretty active on there. You're posting multiple times a day, from what I can tell.
Yeah, too active.
Yeah.
Much too active.
And but you're doing good work on there, and you're taking quite a bit of heat from the other side. And so it's good to have a guy like you on the front lines. And so I thought, Neil, we would start with maybe some background, just to introduce you to the Stand to Reason family, the Stand to Reason audience. You have some pretty impressive credentials. I started looking at your bio, and I was surprised by a few things. First, it says, you're a Princeton undergrad. Then you went to UC Berkeley to get your PhD in quantum computation, if that's right.
Yep.
Postdoc at Yale. Then you went to Duke, and then you just left it all behind because it says you're now currently homeschooling your kids. And so I guess my first question is, what up with that? Okay, like how did that happen? Give us the backstory. You go from Duke researcher, homeschool dad, to now doing live streams like this, where you're talking about contemporary critical theory, like on the regular. So how does that happen?
Yeah. So I always liked science. I'm a trained scientist, and I loved my job doing theoretical chemistry, but it just providentially, things worked out well that my wife finished her training and got a full-time job as a doctor. We conceived our fourth child, and we moved to a new house, and a bunch of other things just happened that it seemed like it would be just, for many reasons, good for me to stay home. I was like, if I'm going to stay home, I'm going to homeschool the kids. Like it just, and because I'm not going to sit around eating bonbons or something. So I'll get bored. So I homeschooled the kids, and I just loved it. I really enjoyed it. I got plugged into a great classical conversations community, and got to teach through that community. Got to invest more time in apologetics work, which I love. And so that's really worked out well. And then, critical theory is something that was not on my radar at all. I was kind of a generalist. I got asked to talk about science and Christianity quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I so I learned about how to defend the reliability of the Bible, how to defend the resurrection, all the standard stuff. And I'd actually written a book on apologetics, which is now we're just trying to get it published now. But I was sort of casting about for things to do, and I got interested in this cultural phenomenon, really, that I saw just taking over our culture and our discourse, and even making inroads into the church. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And I met my friend, a good friend, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who has a PhD in education and cultural studies, and was writing his dissertation on topics relevant to this field of critical theory. And so we connected it, and that's how I got involved in this sort of area of knowledge called critical theory.
Okay, so and this is standard reason we talk about this a lot, blooming where you're planted. And it sounds like, you saw a need, and you've just kind of gone down this rabbit hole, and you just kept going. And now, we were talking about this before, when I go on YouTube and, Google your name or YouTube your name, Neil Shenvy, there are tons of videos. I mean, you're doing, I don't even have enough time to watch all the interviews you've done. I don't know how you've had time to actually do all these interviews, but we're certainly really grateful for the work you're doing, because, and as people are going to see as we go through some of this, there's a lot of concepts, a lot of history, a lot of background that you have to understand. This isn't the kind of topic that you can just, grab a 150-page book and understand it from, cover to cover. You're going deep into the weeds. And so guys like me, and I know the parents out there we're going to talk about how, our kids are going to be bombarded with this. We appreciate the work you're doing there. And so one of the goals in this discussion is to help parents understand this contemporary critical theory that seems to be what everyone's talking about. I even think that Donald Trump, I don't want to bring politics into this. And I'm a Canadian, so, but he just signed an executive order, is my understanding, that will keep, and maybe you know more about this, you can speak to it, but it has to do directly with critical theory.
Yeah, critical race theory in particular.
Oh, okay.
So, and we do get into the weeds a bit, and I know in other interviews people have kind of tried to pull me out and say, let's remind ourselves why we're doing this again, because it does get pretty heady. So I think it might be helpful to start with just some questions that as parents you might hear in a few years from your kids. So imagine, your kid comes home from school one day and says something like, well, don't you think that the gender binary is oppressive and arbitrary? Right? Is it oppressive? or have you when you say something to them about some topic, they say, don't you think you should check your privilege, mom and dad? Or they try to talk to you about some issue and you don't want to talk about it, and they say, well, that's a sign of your fragility, your male fragility, your white fragility. And you've heard these terms like intersectionality, cisgender privilege, all of those terms that I've kind of heard those terms. Well, your kids might come home from middle school, high school, college, and ask you those kind of questions. And so it helps to understand not just how to answer those questions, but why they're even asking them. Right? Why would you think that the gender binary, male and female, the existence of male and female, is itself arbitrary and oppressive?
Yeah.
Why would you even think that? So, and what does intersectionality mean? Where does it come from? What are the assumptions that go into this notion of intersectionality? So all of that, that's where we're headed, trying to understand that phenomenon. Yeah. And that's why it's important.
Yeah, that's really good. So maybe it might help to actually define this idea of contemporary critical theory. Again, without going too deep, and I know this isn't the kind of thing you can answer in a sentence, but give us a sense of how, like, what is critical theory or contemporary critical theory?
Right. So this is where it's complicated already. So the way to think about critical theory is it's a big umbrella term. It's sort of like talking about feminism, right? Or analytic philosophy. It's just this huge umbrella that encompasses lots of different subcategories. So within this broad category of critical theory, you have particular critical theories like critical race theory, queer theory, critical legal studies, critical pedagogy. They're all sub-disciplines within this broad area called critical theory. And me and my collaborator, Pat Sawyer, coined the phrase contemporary critical theory simply to describe the set of ideas that we're seeing in our culture, in our contemporary culture, that's undeniably rooted in this critical tradition. But other people, there's no label out there. There's no one has a term for this ideology. Okay. So Jordan Peterson uses the phrase postmodern neo-Marxism. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of like this Jungian psychologist. James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose wrote a book called Cynical Theories about this ideology, and they use the phrase applied postmodernism. Pastor Tim Keller wrote an article recently where he called this ideology postmodern critical theory. And Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, calls this ideology critical social justice. The point is there's no one label. So use whatever label you favor. The popular term, which I don't like, is cultural Marxism. And it is an academic term, but has also been co-opted by, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. But whatever you want to call it, it's fine with me. I refer to it in a neutral way as contemporary critical theory, but that's the set of ideas that we're dealing with. And then where does it come from? Yeah. Again, very complicated. It goes back ultimately to the ideas of Karl Marx. Now, not his ideas about economics, his ideas about power and things like, and how power circulates within society to create social inequality. But then his ideas about power and knowledge were actually picked up by the Frankfurt School, picked up by Antonio Gramsci, developed by Paulo Freire, Foucault, Michel Foucault, the postmodernist, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the phrase intersectionality. So you have this sort of broad stream that has a lot of different, things washing into it, tributaries. But what we're seeing today, you can identify as this coherent, consistent, overarching meta-narrative. It's a story about reality that's based on a central set of ideas. And again, they're not just me identifying it, but Tim Keller, James Lindsay, Jordan Peterson, and like David French, other writers have commented on it. They know it's out there, but they don't know what to call it. So call it what you want. It's definitely a critical thing.
Okay. So, and we may even get into some of those, you had mentioned intersectionality and white fragility and some of those terms. It may be helpful to maybe as we go and as those things come up, we'll define those terms because I'm sure parents have heard those things and their kids may come home and start throwing around these terms, and it may be helpful to know kind of where they're coming from. In addition, and we want to be proactive, and I'm just thinking about I'm a former high school teacher. And it occurs to me that a lot of teachers, especially in Canada right now, are using this. It's almost like the privilege test, and you maybe you've heard of this, where you get everyone to line up on a line.
Take steps.
Yeah, you take steps. Mm-hmm. And so the question might be something like, are you white? Okay. And if you're white, take a step forward. Mm-hmm. And are you male? Take another step forward. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you raised by two parents? Mm-hmm. Okay. Take another step forward. And you just keep doing this. And the idea is, and sometimes the kids are blindfolded, sometimes they aren't. And then at the end of it, it's like you look at the distance between the students, right? You got all these, all the white male students and coming from these certain economic status and everything. They're in the front. Everyone else there's other people in the back. And it's like, look at the privilege that you have, And so there are these kinds of things happening. Kids are going to come home from that and think, wow, this was so powerful, Sure. And so we want to be able to kind of define these terms and think biblically about these terms as well. Mm-hmm. So maybe at this point, I want to ask you about for Christian parents. I know a lot of people watching are going to be Christian parents, and why should Christian in particular parents think about or care about this issue? It sounds very, it sounds very academic. You're talking about critical theory, contemporary, all these terms, postmodernism. Although you mentioned Tim Keller called it postmodern
critical theory. Mm-hmm.
Isn't the idea of postmodernism though that there is no truth?
Yes.
And
yeah.
so how?
So there's no, So this is why it's so complicated, Tim. And I have to explain this over and over to people. But it's not. For Christian apologists, they hear this sort of postmodern flavor to critical theory, and they try to do the typical postmodern jujitsu. Like this is what they say. White males are oppressive, or there is no white males are objectively oppressive, and you say, is that objectively true? But they'll say yes. You're like, wait a minute, wait, yes, because it's not classical postmodernism. It's not actually. Lindsay and Pluckrose talk about how it went from being this pure postmodernism, which was skeptical of meta-narratives, including Christianity and Marxism. But as it evolved in the 1990s and 2015, even, they would say it gradually changed from a skepticism about all meta-narratives into a meta-narrative itself.
Sure.
And so now it's reached what they call the reified postmodernism stage, where it's actually become its own story about oppression and social justice and liberation. That's actually, it's what originally the people like Foucault and Derrida rejected. So all it's to say is that there are a lot of complicated antecedents to what we're seeing today. And I don't like to get into the weeds too much about where it came from. I want to focus on what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, that's good. And so, so going back to this question, why should Christian parents, because there are obviously ideas have consequences, right? And bad ideas have victims, as John Stonestreet says. And so the bigger the idea, I think maybe you had said this, the bigger the idea, the bigger the consequences. And so
I stole that from someone too, though.
Oh, okay, good. So what should the Christian what are the current concerns or consequences that are coming out of this critical theory, our contemporary critical theory? How is that affecting, the church? And maybe that will get, because my worry is that people are hearing us talk about some of these dead philosophers or whatever, and they're like, this is too academic.
Right.
This has something to do with where I live, and so I want to make this relevant to my family, to the families that are watching us right now. Why should they care? Yeah.
Well, so it sounds all very abstract, but as you said, it's in the schools. I mean, there are numerous, public schools that are implementing the common terms are anti-racism education or culturally sensitive education. And I'm not saying they all necessarily are rooted in this critical tradition or critical race theory, but much of it is. Mm-hmm. And you might think, well, isn't it just dealing with things like race? And sort of, but to the critical theorist, race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, all of these categories are connected. They're all systems of oppression. And what's more, they all have to be combated simultaneously. So in your anti-racism training, you're probably going to find the issues of gender and sexuality coming up. So, for example, the number 2 bestseller on Amazon this summer was Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he says in that book things like, to truly be an anti-racist is to be feminist. To truly be feminist is to be anti-racist. And we cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. So again, you heard all that jargon, all those catchphrases, queer anti-racist, privileges, cisgender, intersections. But, he says outright, you cannot be an anti-racist unless you are a feminist, unless you are LGBTQ affirming. He says later, elsewhere, he says you have to be anti-capitalist. So when you ask, well, can't we just narrow this discussion to race? And the answer is no, because of the intersectional framework that emphasizes that all of these oppressions are connected. So when your kids buy into this way of thinking, it's a worldview. It's functioning as a worldview. It's going to color the way they see everything, not just race, class, and gender, but even things like Christianity, evangelism, missions. There's a book that came out last year called "Can White People Be Saved?" and it was written by came out of Fuller Seminary, a seminar there. It was published by InterVarsity Press. So it's an evangelical seminary.
Wow.
It's an evangelical publisher. And the quotes from the book are just crazy. Let me try to find something. Here's some quotes just from that book. Can white people be saved? Now they're redefining white there and whiteness. They're not defining it in terms of white-skinned people, but that said, they say things like this in that book. Racism has built the epistemologies. That's the way we know truth. Racism has built the epistemologies, worldviews, laws, and educational institutions of our times. Colonialism has colored the very lenses with which we read scriptures.
Wow.
Here's another one. Whiteness is best understood as a religious system of pagan idol worship that thrives on mutually reinforcing circularity between the image, the ideal, or the form, and the social construction of those who worship it. As idolatry, whiteness must be dealt with like any such cultic system. Its high places must be torn down and its altars laid low. Okay, so, and it goes on and on for like 200 pages and not all the essays are that crazy. But the point is, that's just one of many evangelical books coming out right now that are, and they actually, in that book, they actually say at the outset, the essays in this volume are drawing on critical theorists and cutting-edge research into race and ethnicity. There's no question about it. But other authors are either consciously or subconsciously involved in what's called idea laundering. That's a term coming from Brett Weinstein, where what's happening is you have these Christian authors, and you look at, and they're saying all these things that sound like critical theory, but then when you look at their footnotes, they're only citing other Christians. So you're like, that's odd. So you wouldn't know. Then you go to those books and those Christians are citing people like Robin DiAngelo. Oh, and she's a critical race theorist. But you wouldn't know unless you follow the footnotes. So the ideas are being laundered through the academia and then other Christian authors, and then finally getting to, your local Christian bookstore. Now, again, I'm not saying that's intentional. I'm just pointing out that you're not going to see like page 1, critical race theory and introduction on your book. You're going to see like racial reconciliation or how to think about gender. What does the Bible really say about colonialism, right? So that's the title of the book, and the authors cited are all Christians, and yet the ideas are often highly influenced by critical theory. Now, again, I'm not making the genetic fallacy here. The ideas stand or fall on whether they're true or false, period. Yeah. But to understand where these false ideas are coming from is very helpful.
Yeah. And this is a good segue because, there are dominant worldviews in our culture. I think of things like naturalism. We just did a live stream on our channel about that today. We're going through the book, The Universe Next Door. And we talked about naturalism. There's relativism. And this is the cultural water that our kids are swimming in. So like fish that don't know they're wet, okay? And I see that this idea, contemporary critical theory, could fall into that category where there's these ideas that are influencing our kids without even them knowing it, right? You have to go deep, as you're describing, follow the footnotes. They're just hearing it from the pastor. They just read it in a book, or they saw it at someone at their school, and some of these are even Christian schools. I mean, I heard today from a well-known evangelical school, and they had basically a critical race theorist giving the sermon, the chapel. And so I guess what I love about what you're doing is you're identifying key kind of markers or premises of contemporary critical race theory. And so my thinking here is, when I want my kids to know what naturalism is, so that when they see it, they're watching a movie, they're in conversations with people, they're able to identify it. They're not going to get taken in by it because they know the signs. They know kind of what to look for, the identifying markers. Same with relativism. So I'm thinking, okay, so looking at this ideology, contemporary critical theory, what are and you outlined 4 identifying premises, like core central claims of critical theory. So why don't you break those down for us?
Sure. And like I said, these are just for ideas. I don't know if you'll find them listed anywhere. You'll find them in these books. I can give you dozens of quotations, but it's common to all of these disciplines. So critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonialism or decolonialism, they'll have different emphases. They'll apply these ideas to colonialism or to race, to gender, to sexuality, but they are really working within the same framework. And especially there's been a convergence in the last, say, 10 or 20 years under this intersectional rubric. But here are the four ideas. The first one is the social binary. So contemporary critical theory divides social reality into two main groups, the oppressors and the oppressed, along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. So let me just read you a quote here. This is from Senso and D'Angelo in their book, Is Everyone Really Equal? They write, for every social group, there's an opposite group. The primary groups that we name here are race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, status, exceptionality, religion, and nationality. And so then along all those axes, you have various forms of oppression. So they say sexism, racism, classism, and heterosexism are specific forms of oppression. And you can find figures and tables with various oppressions and then the oppressed group, the oppressor group, along, again, 8 to 10 different identity categories. And now intersectionality says that there can be overlap that it changes the way that you experience life. So for example, you could be both an oppressor and an oppressed person with respect to different identity markers. So you might be a white woman, in which case you would be an oppressor with respect to your race, but you would be oppressed with respect to your gender. So there can be overlap and different, and that will affect the way that you experience life and are treated. So it complicates the social binary, but it doesn't erase it. You're still either oppressed or oppressor with respect to, like, say, gender.
So I don't want people to miss this. So what you're saying is, okay, before I do anything, okay, I'm not going and burning down my neighbor's house or anything like that. Just the fact that I exist as a white male, you're telling me that puts me, you got like a grid, right? You got a table. And so those are two strikes against me, right? Because white puts me as an oppressor and so does male. Is that right?
That's right. So oppression, this is the second thing. Oppression occurs through ideology, not just through action. So oppression almost primarily is about the ideology that society has accepted as common sense, natural, normal, taken for granted. But those ideas that we accept as normal, critical theorists believe they are imposed on us by the ruling class, whether the ruling class are whites, heterosexuals, men, the rich. They have these ideas and these values that actually serve to justify their own interests. So they justify why whites or men or heterosexuals or the rich or the physically able-bodied, why those people are normal and they deserve to be on top. So that's how oppression takes place. And that's why you'd see things like, racism, say, listed alongside cisgenderism as both oppressions, because they're all about normalizing, in one case, whiteness, and in the other case, the gender binary, right? So those are two ways in which the normal is being defined by the ruling class. That is oppression. And so there's a lot there. And now you said if you're a white man and there are two strikes against you, well, okay, it's a little complicated, because the other kind of bizarre thing they'll do is they'll say, we're talking about systems and structures and ideologies, not really individual moral qualities. Okay. So D'Angelo will say, when I say that you're racist, I don't mean you're a bad person. Now Christians would be like, wait a minute, racism is a sin. So if I'm a racist, then almost by definition, I'm a bad person. She says no. Because you're white, you're socialized into white supremacy. You're socialized into this deeply racist patterns and worldview. It's not your fault, though. So while you're not a bad person for being socialized into racism, into being part of this oppressive system and oppressive class, yes, you are. She would say, certainly you're an oppressor, but you're not to blame, except that now you have the duty, the responsibility to commit to a lifelong process of becoming an anti-racist. So it's a little bit weird in that they would not actually just say old white males are evil. I mean, not at least the scholars wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
On a popular level, maybe, but scholars would say, okay, you're in this oppressor group and you've been socialized into oppressive thinking. So the way your mind works is oppressive. You can't help that, but now you have to unlearn your racism. You have to unlearn your misogyny. You have to unlearn your heteronormativity and begin a lifelong process of learning how to be anti-oppressive. So it's sort of what it gives with one hand, it takes away with the other hand, right? Because they're not saying you're evil, but if you don't commit to this lifelong process, now you're morally responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a moral quality to it. I'm just wondering now, okay, so is there a way to become anti-racist, or is this just, do I just spend the rest of my existence as an oppressor who's doing his best?
You have to do the work. You do your best. You do better. You do the work. Yeah. Actually, Kendi recently, a few days ago, said like no one is ever an anti-racist. And D'Angelo too has said, Kendi is black. D'Angelo is a white woman. But D'Angelo says, it's a constant process, a lifelong learning experience. She has to, even now, she makes, without exaggeration, tens of thousands of dollars per engagement telling people about racism and teaching them about anti-racism. But she'll say to you, I am racist. I have these deeply, in her book, it's like, it's like page like 123 or something. But I have deeply racist patterns still. I'm still learning. I'll never reach the end of my anti-racist education. So they're, it's an identity for them. You identify as an anti-racist. They talk about conversion to anti-racism. Actually, one of the quotes from that book, Can White People Be Saved, talks about needing to, I gotta find it. The quote is so insane, but it talks about how you need like a second conversion to anti-racism as a white Christian, like to achieve. Yeah, here you go. This is from, I think it's Draper's essay. It says, Christian discipleship that entails a deconversion from whiteness is necessary if any true experience of reconciliation with God, others, the creation, and ourselves is to take place. So you're a Christian, good. But to be a true disciple and to experience reconciliation with God, you need to undergo a deconversion from whiteness. Now, again, whiteness is being redefined to mean like basically racism and white supremacy. But they're really serious about this being an identity. I mean, Joseph Bart's book, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church, is the same thing. It's an identity. You need to be, these are Christian anti-racists saying you have to be born again and comparing it to, they themselves are comparing it to spiritual rebirth.
Wow.
So it's not me putting that into their mouth. They're saying things like we need to be, or we're like the blind, their common metaphor is like, we're like the blind man in John 9. We can't say we need Jesus to heal our racial blindness. That's another very common metaphor. So yeah, that's pretty deep. This is not superficial transformation they're talking about. They're talking about really transforming our identity.
Yeah. So, okay. So, we're talking about, we're going to explain this, we want to understand it so we can identify it, explain to our kids. So you start with the social binary. You got to explain there's two groups. There's the oppressed and the oppressor. And then oppression through ideology was the second one. This seems to me, I mean, what's happening here is there's a whole lot of redefinition of terms, right? Mm-hmm. Like what oppression, what I used to take to be oppression doesn't sound like oppression, right?
Right.
And so is there a way that this is undermining real oppression? Like when I look around the world, I see people that seem to me that they are genuinely oppressed, where this seems to be something different.
Yeah, I mean, I think it inevitably does do that, right? Because like you said, there are actual, sex slaves in the world. I think there are more slaves today in the world than in history.
Yeah.
So they're actually oppressed. They're actually subject to, the dictionary defines oppression as like prolonged, cruel, unjust treatment or control. They are truly oppressed. And there are many people that are truly oppressed on a day-to-day basis. Whereas, saying that, to take an obvious example, but to say that, if, you believe that male and female are God-ordained categories, right, and that are good categories, someone's not oppressed because you said that, right? But they would say that idea of the gender binary is oppressive, and that they they're facing the terms are like metaphysical violence when you say to them that no, actually they're biologically they're two sexes and they're expressed as two genders. That is violence, that is oppression, that is invalidating their very existence. And so you see that kind of language used quite a lot.
Okay, so we got the first two down. Then you talk about something called lived experience.
Yeah.
So what's that about?
So contemporary critical theory embraces something called standpoint epistemology, which says two things. One is that our knowledge is all socially situated. So what we know, we don't actually know objectively. Now, they get kind of fuzzy on that word there, because what they're saying is all human beings are socially situated knowers. We know things as, say, it's tricky here. We know things as, say, a half Indian male. Not saying I know things as, say, a person living in North Carolina with a PhD. No, it's actually in terms of these social categories. So this is where, race, class, gender come in. They're not making a claim that like you, Tim Barnett, have certain experiences that are unique to you as an individual. They're saying that you have experiences that are common to your classes, whether it's male, white, heterosexual, whatever. And then, so that will shape your knowledge. There is no objective knowledge. Now, again, this is not a theistic worldview. So we would say, well, at least God's knowledge is objective, right? But they wouldn't include that. So,
yeah.
So then you have all you have is perspectives. Okay, you have different perspectives on the truth. Now, they wouldn't deny that truth exists. This is key. They wouldn't say, well, everything's relative then, because the key is this. They believe that oppressed people have special access to truths about their oppression. They have better access to truths about their oppression in general, not universally, but in general, oppressed people are better situated to understand truths about their oppression. So there is an actual truth about reality, a social reality, but being at the bottom, being on the margins gives you a better access to that truth through your lived experience. And there's a complicated reason why they think that. But the bottom line is that, therefore, you should, as a person in an oppressor group, you should then defer to the claims of people on the margins. You should center them and platform them because they are better able to see the reality to which you are naturally blinded, if that makes sense. So yeah, there are a bunch of quotes about that idea I can give you.
Well, I'm just thinking, so if I appeal to data, okay, or evidence, okay, so someone experiences something and they're marginalized, they're down on the pole, I guess, for whatever, intersectionality, or, maybe they're gay and black and, whatever.
Yeah.
And I say, well, your particular view is mistaken, and here's the research to back it up. Is that appropriate, or does their lived experience trump the evidence that I put forward? So is there still an appreciation for truth, like objective truth there, or does the lived experience truth trump the data?
Well, see, that this is why it's not relativism. They would not say immediately. They wouldn't just say, well, they wouldn't just say immediately, well, that's your truth, but my truth is different, right? What they would say is that is you're appealing to science, but science is a Western white supremacist male construct. So you're claiming that this goes back to the idea that there are these what's called a hegemonic discourse. There are these ways of approaching truth that have been imposed on us by the ruling classes, say white men, have decided that they're going to impose the scientific method on us. And then they're going to use those scientific claims to justify their own dominance. And if you actually noticed this a couple months ago, the Smithsonian Institute had an infographic about the attributes of a white culture. And on that, this is Smithsonian Institute of African American History. And they listed the various elements of white culture and whiteness. And one of them was objective linear thinking, and cause and effect relationships were listed as elements of a white culture. You're like, wait, what? That sounds like a neo-Nazi manifesto, but at the Smithsonian. But again, the idea is that what we think of as objective and natural and universal claims are actually the claims of the ruling class. So when you appeal to, say, scholars, or scholars say this, or studies show that X, this public figure says Y, they'll say, well, you're appealing to these white Western authority structures or these white Western ways of knowing, but we have other ways of knowing that are intuitive or indigenous. And so here's a great quote from, you think people like this is, they don't really believe this. Here's a quote from Anderson and Collins' anthology, Race, Class, and Gender. They write, "The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book." So they're saying there are other ways to get to objectivity, meaning this view of truth, that's not through rational thought. It's through other ways of knowing, intuitive, indigenous. And there's some really crazy examples of this, taking this to the extreme. But in general, what people would say is, your quote unquote objective truth cannot trump my experiences because I know what I know as an oppressed person about these. Now they usually wouldn't say things like, I don't think the earth is a sphere, right? Because their lived experience applies to their oppression. Yeah. That said, there's been a real blow up on Twitter in the last few months over whether 2 + 2 = 4. I kid you not. Just go on Twitter and search for 2 + 2 = 4, and you'll see all of these social scientists arguing about whether or not 2 + 2 really equals 4, whether it's just one way of thinking about numbers. So that's very much,
that's a masculine way to think.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then the last premise is social justice. So tell us about that.
Right. So social justice, within the context of contemporary critical theory, is defined as the elimination of all social oppression. I'm going to quote from Mary McClintock's essay. She writes, social justice is the elimination of all forms of social oppression. Social injustice takes many forms. It can be based on a person's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, physical or mental ability, or economic class. So what you don't see there with the defining of social justice, you don't see injustice being associated with, say, crime, right? Hurting people. It's all about these different groups, one of which is an oppressor group, one's an oppressed group. And social justice involves equalizing power between these two groups. That's when you know you've achieved social justice, when these two groups can share power. There's no longer this hierarchy of resources, outcomes, etc.
Okay. So I actually have a follow-up. I mean, practically speaking, is there worry that the oppressed could become the oppressor? Or is that... And then it's like, then we're just going to go the other way.
Yeah, they're pretty emphatic. Critical theorists are emphatic that they do not want an inversion of power. They're emphatic about that. What they say is that we want power to be shared. Actually, I think the phrase that the old Frankfurt School used was something like participatory democracy. They wanted true democracy, meaning in their mind, power is shared between groups. Now, what I will say, though, is that they will add a caveat, which is that in the short term, we may have to put the people on the margins at the center. So in the short term, we may have to actually give power to what's called the subaltern or the marginalized, the oppressed, in order to reach a long-term goal of inclusion, social justice, diversity, etc. So, but they wouldn't, and they also would say that by equalizing power relationships, they will liberate both the oppressed and the oppressor, because they I think rightly see that people that are actual oppressors are actually oppressed by their own oppression, right? In other words, being a dictator or a tyrant, as a Christian would say, is actually that you're actually in bondage to sin. So they have a similar view, is that people that are at the top of this hierarchy are themselves also being captive to this malformed and ultimately destructive power relationship, so that by equalizing power, they're going to liberate both the oppressor and the oppressed. So anyway, but the bottom line is they wouldn't outright say we want to just invert everything. They're going to say we want equality. Okay, the term they use is equity. They want equity, but in the short term, that may involve inverting the power dynamics, at least in the short term.
So because I think the real practical help for teaching is going to be in the comparing and contrasting the worldviews, or the critical theory ideology and the Christian worldview. And when you see that, I mean, I know when I teach my kids, it's good to, here's one, here's the other. And then when you have them side by side, it's easier to see, yes, Christianity you can't put it together with this kind of contemporary critical theory. But before we get there, I wanted to ask about positives. Like, is there anything positive about contemporary critical theory? We've been teaching my daughter about, or we're prepping to teach her about sex. Okay, my oldest daughter, and reading all these books and everything else. And many parents, I think, they'll focus on all the ways that sex is wrong. Christian parents is like, don't do this, don't do that, sex is wrong. And then, then they get kind of a skewed view. They go, it's too extreme, because we know that sex can be good, sex is good and true and beautiful when done in the right context, right? God has created sex. And so I'm wondering, is there a sense in which contemporary critical theory can be good and true? Are there any things that we can pull out of it and say, this part of it's good?
Yeah, I think there are elements of it that we can say reflect the truth. And this is why it is so attractive. If it were pure poison and lies from start to finish, people would just be like, well, that's obviously not true. The fact that it borrows or is parasitic on the truth is why it is, so in a sense, infectious. So, for example, it correctly says oppression is bad, oppression is evil, that justice is good. And as Christians, we should say, well, yes and amen. You're totally wrong in how you identify, or you are often totally wrong in how you identify oppression and justice. But when you get it right, you're right. So there are truly unjust systems. Sin can infect systems. So sin is not purely on an individual level. Sin is primarily against God, yes, but sin can infect our laws. For example, when we think about chattel slavery in the US, think about apartheid in South Africa, think about abortion today, right? Sin, our individual sin against our creator, has then been codified into law. That's a real thing. Hegemonic power, the idea that ideas can promote certain false views of the world and of people. That's true. Think about how Hollywood has just saturated our culture with false, unbiblical views of beauty and sexuality, right? That's hegemonic power. That's the power of ideas. So we shouldn't deny that's the case. We should be actually actively seeking to reform our ideologies to scripture. So what I would say too is that I think one of the huge mistakes Christians make is, and the reason why, again, this ideology is so attractive, is that many times the first real discussion, many times, not always, but many times, the first real serious discussion of, say, race happens in college from a non-Christian, actually critical race theory infused perspective. So then your student comes home from college thinking that the way that real scholars talk about race just is critical race theory. Critical race theory just means how real scholars talk about race. So what you have to do is actually prep them to say, no, the right way to think about race or gender or sexuality or anything is from a biblical perspective. And then when they go to college, they'll at least have this check that says, wait a minute, I've heard this before from a different perspective. Now, which perspective is true? And then hopefully they'll say, well, the Bible's perspective is true. And this other perspective needs to be then tested against what the Bible says. But they'll be prepared. And I think what happens oftentimes is they're just blown away because they've never heard anything about race or the history of slavery or lynching in this country. Our country has my country has a horrific racial past. We don't have to hide that. We don't have to ignore the good that our country has done. And I'm proud to be an American, but we should talk about the reality of history, because if we don't, our kids will be easy prey to these very deceptive and ultimately false ways of thinking.
So when you, maybe I'll jump on this question then. When you talk to your kids, we've had conversations around the dinner table about race.
Mhm.
And for us, we start with the idea that we're all made in the image of God.
Sure.
And that, we're all equal and we're all equally valuable. It doesn't matter of our skin color. And of course, we're defining race to, kind of the traditional way, not to mean all these other things.
Mhm.
But how do you, what does it look like at the Shenvy dinner table, when you're talking about race?
Sure. One of the big things that critical race theory tends to problematize is the idea of color blindness. Now, traditionally, what color blindness means, I think colloquially, is that we don't let a person's color or race or ethnicity dictate how we treat or value them. That's what usually people mean when they say I'm colorblind. They don't literally mean they can't tell whether you're white or black or brown or purple. They mean that they don't let your race affect how they treat you as a human being, which is a good thing. I mean, obviously that's a good thing. But the way that critical race theorists define colorblindness is to mean that you pretend not to see a person's race, although obviously we all do. And then because you pretend not to see it, it makes you sort of just in this, you're living a lie, basically. It's like saying, because we do see race. We're socialized into seeing race as a socially salient feature, right? Yeah. Just like you notice when someone's a man or a woman, right? You just notice it. You don't not notice it. You're like, oh, I didn't notice. You noticed. But I think so. What we have to recapture is we should say, actually, it's true. We shouldn't pretend. And I think Christians, in reaction to people saying colorblindness is wrong, they say, no, it's right. I don't see race at all. Well, that's not true. And they'll appeal to Galatians 3:26 through 28. They'll say, doesn't the Bible say there's no, saved nor free, male or female, Greek or Jew anymore? We're all just Christians. Let's stop talking about race entirely. And I would argue that's actually a bad use of that passage, because in that passage, he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. But we would never dream of claiming that gender blindness is God's design for us, right? We're not gender blind because gender is a good thing. Now, race is different because race is a social construct. There are not actual biological races in the modern sense, right? There are ethnicities, and ethnicity is a biblical category. There are people that are ethnic groups. There are ancestral categories. There are populations. There are people with dark skin and light skin. But the point is labeling people as black or white or, brown or Asian. I mean, the funniest one for me is Asian. Asian. Do you know how big Asian is? We're like, oh, he's Asian. Really? Have you been to Asia?
Yeah.
So that right off the bat, you're like, when someone says Asian, it's like that shows you that we've built these categories and then imparted, oftentimes, to be fair to the critical race theorists, we've imparted very stereotypical and hurtful and stupid meanings to these categories that they shouldn't be there. So that's fair. So what we have to recapture there is a biblical understanding, one, of humanity. We're all made in God's image. We all share that in common. It doesn't matter whether, the color of your skin, your gender, your age, your health. We're all made in God's image. 2, we're all sinners. So we're all rebels against God. We have what Miroslav Volf calls solidarity in sin. So no one is wholly other to me. I'm like, oh, they're the bad people. You know who thought that way is the Pharisee in Luke 18, right? I think you got I'm not like that guy. Well, we can say we're all like that guy. We're all sinners naturally. And then we all share the need for a savior, Jesus Christ. So those 3 doctrines of human solidarity really undermine racism, classism, sexism, but also contemporary critical theory for exactly the same reason, because they're saying ultimately you share this deep bond in creation, redemption, creation, sin, and redemption. And then on top of that, so my dad's Indian, and so my kids are like, oh, Pop has dark skin, and we teach them about racial categories. We say that, like, we'll say that to them, they're like, there's dark skin and light skin. He has light skin, and my kids are kind of diverse colors. My daughter got my sort of tan skin. My other daughter got really light skin. And so we talk about that. It's fine. We don't make a big deal of it. Yeah. And we also talk about racial history. We talk about slavery. We talk about the civil rights movement. We talk about lynching. We talk about really hard things. Yeah. We talk about how some people treat others badly because of their skin color and how silly that is and how that's evil that is. So we don't hide those discussions. but we first lay the framework of a biblical anthropology. And that really does a lot to undermine this view of human beings. And then, like I said, we do explain to kids, oh, your friend, your friend Isaiah, people would see him as black. They're like, but he's brown. I'm like, I get it. But people would call him black. And some people might even think badly about him. That's really terrible. But we don't hide the ugly truth, and we extend them these social categories. But I don't want them playing a major role in their lives. I want them to recognize that these things, people see these things, but I don't want them as Christians to think they determine how I treat someone.
That's so good. Neil, I remember when we told our kids at the dinner table that there are people that mistreat others because of their skin color. They were just seeing the look on their face, just jaws open. Like, how is that even possible? You know? And so you've given us some really good practical tools there. I want to make sure we get to this though, before we end. So we got contemporary, what you're calling contemporary critical theory, and we got the Christian worldview. Okay. And you in one of your talks kind of go through 5 big worldview questions. Who we are, what's our fundamental problem, what's the solution, primary moral duty, purpose of life. I just, in the next kind of like 5-6 minutes, could we just like kind of side by side kind of go through how does each one of the ideology and the Christian worldview, how do they answer these questions? And this might be a good exercise to go through, that parents could go through with their kids. Sure. And say, here's the difference between these two things. And you can see that they don't go together. They don't fit. Yeah. So let's start with that first question. Who are we?
Who are we? Christianity says we're primarily the creatures of a loving, good, holy, and just God. Critical theory says, no, you're primarily the members of various social groups locked in a struggle for dominance. What's our fundamental problem? Christianity says you're a rebel against this God. You're a sinner. Critical theory says your fundamental problem is oppression and injustice. What's the solution? Christianity says you can't do anything to save yourself, but Jesus came to rescue you from God's wrath and to redeem you so that you can be born again. Critical theory says the solution is activism, is divesting of privilege and sitting in solidarity with those who are oppressed. Your primary moral duty in life is to glorify God as a Christian, but critical theory says no, it's to fight against oppression. And your purpose, again, what's your purpose in life? To glorify God again, and again, by obeying him, by trusting in him. Critical theory says, no, your purpose is to work to overturn these systems and structures which produce injustice. So there's just no way to marry these two different worldviews, right? You'll be forced to choose between them at every turn in terms of your resources, your time, your priorities, your values. So, and it bleeds into every area of life, not just you're like, oh, just combine it to race. It's like, no, they will be the first to tell you that you cannot just be an anti-racist. You have to also be a feminist, an LGBTQ ally, etc. You have to be anti-Christian hegemony, right? You can't tell them that your religion is the true, universally, objectively true one. That's oppressive. So all those areas will be incompatible with Christian belief.
Yeah, isn't the Bible, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as a Christian, the Bible is just one, you're calling it hegemonic power, right? It's God telling you the way it's supposed to be, right? And here's how marriage is, here's how sex works, here, gender, you kind of go through this. And so how can a Christian accept the truths of the scripture, and at the same time hold to contemporary critical theory or critical race theory? How do you make those fit?
You can't. You have to start questioning whether it really is a singular, universal set of values and norms. And we saw that in that book I quoted, the Seacrest book, where they talk about it. Maybe they're actually a point in one of the authors says, within Western epistemology, you can't be a Christian and also follow indigenous religions because she says, because you guys believe that you can't affirm both P and not P at the same time. But within indigenous epistemologies, we don't have to observe that law of non-contradiction. So we can both affirm Christianity is true and also these indigenous religions are also true. There's no contradiction there because we don't believe in that Western epistemology. So it's going really deep here into how it affects your view of reality. So that's wow. you can, and I guess I am concerned. I do not want to discourage people from having deep conversations about race, class, gender, justice. By all means, we should have those conversations. We have to simultaneously be aware of this alternate view of reality that is out there, that is coming into the church at a breakneck speed.
Yeah. So what kind of resources, you mentioned you're working on a book with a co-author, and of course you got a website. So tell us, where should parents go if they're trying to equip themselves so they can have good conversations with their kids? What would you recommend?
There's a great book coming out, I think soon, by a Biola professor named Thaddeus Williams. It's called Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. Now, I actually wrote a short essay in that book with other people too, Monique Toussaint, I think, Samuel Say. But it doesn't touch on critical theory directly, but indirectly it answers a lot of these questions. But it's a very helpful, easy to read book. Unfortunately, there's not a really great book out there right now for Christians about critical theory. There's just not one. Douglas Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds, he's an atheist, but he talks about culturally what we're seeing with these different movements. But Lindsay and Pluckrose's cynical theories really gets into the detail of where these ideas are coming from. They trace the ideas back to the postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida, and see how it's evolved since the 1960s and 70s. It's a little technical though, so I would start with Williams's book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. When it comes out.
And then, of course, if they want to hear more about what you're speaking on and essays you've written, they can go to your website, which is shenvyapologetics.com. Is that right?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Is there any kind of, I know we're just over the hour here, but I'll ask you this anyways. Do you have any kind of parting thoughts for parents who may be feeling overwhelmed? I mean, the first part of our conversation, if you're just listening for the first time on this issue, you're probably feeling pretty overwhelmed. And so that's why you got to go back and probably listen to this again, listen to some your other longer talks where you can go into more details with your slides. I think those your PowerPoint, which is really helpful to see it. But is there any kind of advice or thoughts you want to give to parents about this?
Sure. The first thing I would say is just teach your kids the Bible and basic theology. Just give them a really firm grounding in biblical truth and theology and how it impacts things like race, class, gender, politics, justice, etc. Give them an overarching framework that's really solid. And oftentimes these other issues then will immediately set off alarms when people start saying things like, power is oppressive. They'll say, wait a minute, God is omnipotent. So they'll start hopefully questioning immediately, like, wait a minute, that doesn't fit within my Christian framework. So start with the Bible and basic theology right off the bat. Then second thing I would say is that, and this is a big one, truth comes first. Truth comes before feelings and empathy. This is so important. I think Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, talks about how people see morality differently, but one of the major moral levers that can be pulled is the empathy lever, that making you feel sorry for people that are suffering. We all have that lever in us, and it's good. God put it there. We should feel sorry for the vulnerable and work to have compassion on them and to alleviate their suffering. But critical theory yanks really hard on that lever and says you feel this way about these people, feel bad for them, empathize with them, and that's how to be a good person. That's how to be just. And we should say yes and amen. We should care about people's feelings and empathize with the vulnerable. But truth must dictate what form our love looks like. So if a simple example, if a woman is anorexic and feels really bad about her body, and it wants you to tell her how fat she is, even though she's starving to death, does not matter if she will be angry. If you say to her, no, you're starving to death, you need to eat more, you have a medical condition, she might get really angry with you. She might say, you don't love me, you don't tell me what I want. But you say, because I love you, I'm going to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And in so many areas, I think critical theory weaponizes our feelings of empathy to make us say things that are not actually true. And then here's the thing. You say, oh, yeah, right. I mean, plenty of Christians don't love enough, and you're telling them to be less empathetic. No, I'm not telling them that. I'm telling them that real love has to be rooted in truth. And if you really love someone, if you really feel empathy for them, you want what's best for them, but you can't know what's best for them if you don't know the truth about them. So that is, you hammer that home to your kids. I tell my kids, if I'd given you everything you wanted at age 3, they're like, what would have happened to you? They'd be like, I would be dead because I'd be playing in that on the highway. I would be drinking poison. I said, it's exactly right. And now you're 11. Should I give you everything you want now that you feel you want? And they say no. So they get that truth has to come first to really be love. You cannot love without truth. And so hammer that home to your kids so that they don't feel like they're going to be told they're not loving. You're not loving. You hate me. They have to be confident and say, no, I do love you truly, but because I love you truly, I must love you in truth.
Yeah. That is a good word to leave on. Neil, I just want to thank you so much, man, for taking the time to do this broadcast. If people want more information, we mentioned, just go to Shenvy, apologetics.com. You speak on this issue a lot, but you do the whole apologetic thing. So if people wanted to invite you, well, I don't know if anyone's inviting right now because of COVID, but to do these kinds of events,
I can Zoom.
You can Zoom. So there you go. We hope, audience out there, we hope this conversation was helpful for you. It certainly was helpful for me. If you like this interview, what we want to do is encourage you to like the platform you're on. Leave comments. If you want to hear more interviews like this, that's great. That lets us know what you guys like. Be sure to follow STR on Facebook, on YouTube, all that stuff. Again, thanks for spending time with us. Remember, love God, love others, and God bless. Take care.